Hey there! If you love exploring Christian philosophy and theology, you're in the right place. The video's about to get started, but first, I want to ask you a question. Do you find the content I produce on this channel valuable? If so, here are some ways you can help promote it. The first is completely free. Give this video a like, comment, and subscribe to the channel. Second, consider doing a one-time donation, kind of like a tip. You can do this in the form of a super chat or super thanks below. Third, consider becoming a patron. Patrons get early access to videos, they get to be a part of a patron-only Facebook group we call TAC Academy, and patrons can participate in the book club that meets on Zoom once a month. The link to become a patron is in the description. Thanks to all my current patrons for your support. Enjoy the interview.
Can faith be rational? You might think the answer is no if what you're looking at are a bunch of YouTube atheists, but I'm joined by an expert, Dr. Liz Jackson, who has written on this topic. She's published an essay in this book, A New Theist Response to the New Atheists, chapter 6, called The Nature and Rationality of Faith. So thank you so much, Dr. Jackson, Liz, for joining me again.
Thanks for having me. I'm always honored and excited to be on this channel. And I'm excited about this topic. It's a fun one. So, yeah.
Yeah, I haven't done a video on this topic yet, and I thought that I need to get Liz on, and I read this essay. It was a great essay, so I'm excited to unpack it.
Yeah.
Let me ask you first, how did that book come about? It's got a lot of good essays in it.
Yeah, it's a great book. I encourage people listening to go check it out. Like, there's a ton of different topics that are covered. I know there's Dustin Crummett and Philip Swinson have a paper on the moral knowledge argument. I think you've had both of them on at various times. Josh Rasmussen, who I think you've had on, and he's been on a lot of YouTube stuff. Well, he's actually one of the editors, but also has a paper in it. And there's quite a bit of different sorts of topics ranging from, arguments to God's existence to more practical, ethics and political stuff even. So it's a fun book, but yeah, basically Josh Rasmussen and Kevin Valier are the editors, and they just thought, there's this kind of space for Christian philosophers to be responding, not just to atheist philosophers, which is great, and that discussion has happened a lot, but also to maybe more popular sort of atheists and kind of more popular conceptions, of atheism and theism. But there hasn't been as much discussion, I think, between Christian philosophers and these more popular kind of atheist movements. And so this book is specifically about the new atheists, which traditionally I think there's 4 of them, hopefully. So Richard Dawkins, Sam Harris, Daniel Dennett,
Christopher Hitchens.
Thank you. Yes. And so this book is kind of responding. It's mostly to those 4, but then there's some other people that I think have kind of gotten on the movement and also written some books on the topic as well. And so there's a lot of different things these people say. Some of your listeners are probably pretty familiar. Others maybe are less familiar. But we thought it would be cool to have a place where kind of Christian philosophers could come and sort of respond to some of the arguments that some of these thinkers have given. So my paper is specifically focused on what they've said about faith. And actually, maybe if you don't mind, I can actually even tell you sort of how I came across this paper, or sort of what inspired it, or, they had kind of thought maybe writing something in religious epistemology, and then I had kind of narrowed down the topic of faith. So what I actually did is I got digital copies of 15 or 20 of the books written by these 4, and then I think some other people that sort of explicitly called themselves new atheists. And I actually did Control F, and I typed in faith, and I just went through and looked at, sometimes it was a few sentences or a paragraph, sometimes it was a section, sometimes it was a whole chapter, and just tried to look at everything they were saying about faith. And as you'll see, we'll go through a lot of different possibilities of what faith might be and different views of faith. But I kind of tried to put all of those as much as I could into one paper and kind of respond in general to this objection that they make, which is that faith cannot be rational, or faith is irrational.
Yeah, that's really interesting. All right. So why don't we go ahead and jump into the paper here?
Yeah.
At the very beginning, you talk about 2 types of rationality. What are those 2 types of rationality?
Yeah, so I kind of open with this distinction that's commonly made among philosophers, especially epistemologists, between what's known as epistemic rationality on the one hand, and then practical rationality on the other hand. So one way you can kind of think about this distinction is that epistemic rationality is sort of rationality that's aimed at the truth. And this is often associated with things like knowledge. So your beliefs are epistemically rational when they, could be knowledge or amount to knowledge or some, there's some connection with knowledge. It's also, people just will say justified belief. People often use, epistemically justified belief, epistemically rational belief interchangeably. But, examples of this would be beliefs that fit the evidence, beliefs that are formed from a reliable process of belief formation, that sort of thing. And so the real maybe best way to sort of unite all this is to say it's aimed at the truth. And epistemic rationality is often the kind of rationality that we use when we're talking about beliefs. So when we say a belief is rational or irrational, normally what we're talking about is epistemic rationality. So that contrasts with practical rationality, which I said maybe like it's a goal-aimed rationality, but it's associated with what's good for you or what would promote your welfare or your flourishing. So it's practically rational to brush your teeth. It's practically rational to save for retirement. If I have a paper due in a week, it's practically rational for me to sit down and write it, So it's often sort of actions that are associated with your goals or are a way to meet your goals. So normally practical rationality is used to evaluate action rather than beliefs. So there's kind of beliefs, epistemic rationality, truth aimed. Then there's actions, practical rationality, and that's focused on the good or what your goals are.
And I think either I've heard you say this or I've heard Andrew Moon say this.
Yeah.
One of you said it to me, and that is these two can come apart.
Yes.
Epistemic and rational. It's not always the case that if something's practically rational, then it's epistemically rational and vice versa. I think I've heard you give the case of your family being kidnapped by some like evil scientist or something, and you're told, look, I'm going to kill your whole family unless you take this pill, which makes you have a false belief about the 100th digit of pi.
Yeah.
And it's your choice. Do you want to take the pill or not? And you might think, well, it would be practically rational for me to take the pill, but it would be epistemically irrational of me to take the pill. Am I getting that right?
Yep, that's a really good case. There's a lot of cases where something could be epistemically but not practically rational, or practically but not epistemically rational. But I think that's a nice case where it's very clear, like, yeah, if all my goal is getting at the truth, I shouldn't, take a pill that gives me a false belief. But my family's lives, that's more associated with my good, my flourishing, my goals than like having this belief about this random digit of pi. So that's a nice kind of illustrative case to sort of show the difference between the two kinds.
All right. Now, the New Atheists, you give lots of quotes where they just kind of say things like, they almost define faith as irrational in some places. But your point is, well, wait a minute. What kind of rationality are we talking about? Are we talking about epistemic rationality or practical rationality? You got to make that distinction. So can faith be practically rational, even if it does turn out to be epistemically irrational?
Yes. So absolutely. I think that's definitely true. And I think first of all, just being clear about the kind of rationality we're talking about is important. So that's just one reason to bring up this distinction. But another reason is that even if for some reason, and I don't think this is true, but for some reason we found out faith is not a good means to getting at the truth, or faith is not epistemically rational, it could still be that faith is rational in other senses, specifically in this practical sense. And so part of what I do in the paper here is I actually try to give examples of cases, and I think this is pretty widely recognized among philosophers, but I'm not sure if like the New Atheists, for example, recognize this, but a number of cases where it's actually rational to act as if something's true, even if that thing is really unlikely to be true or unlikely given your evidence. And so it's important to note that sort of rational action and rational belief can kind of come apart in this way. So two examples I give in the paper. So let's suppose you're a judge on a court case and you have to kind of issue a verdict, an official legal verdict about whether someone is guilty or innocent. And in court cases, you can have inadmissible evidence, which is evidence that's not, for various reasons, allowed to be sort of used in a court of law. But so you might say, like, given, like, let's say I have this inadmissible evidence that, let's say, someone is guilty. Given that evidence, I should probably, assuming it's good evidence, I should probably believe that they're guilty. But because it's inadmissible, it's not like legally usable in a court of law, I have to act as if they're innocent. So it's a case where, like, because of the legal norms in my role as a judge, I have to act as if this person's innocent, even though I have this evidence that they're guilty and I should believe they're guilty. Mm-hmm. So it's practically rational for me to act as if they're innocent. I keep getting innocent and guilty confused here. Right. Yeah, but epistemically rational for me to believe they're guilty. So that's one example. Another example is a case where maybe you take your children out to play in the wintertime and there's a frozen lake, and let's just say, like, you have pretty good evidence that the ice is solid. Maybe it's been winter for a long time and you're kind of up north or whatever, and your children are like, oh, can we go play in the middle of this frozen lake, right? It might be epistemically rational for you to believe that the ice is solid and would hold them if they went and played on it, but there's a huge risk involved in that, obviously, and it's not really worth just like letting your kids go play on that ice. So again, it's rational to act as if the ice will break practically, but not epistemically rational to believe the ice will break. Yeah. And when we're talking about faith, one way to look at faith is faith as an action. Faith is something that you do. You can act as if, something's true, or sort of, like do a trust fall or take a chance on someone or something, or even take Pascal's wager. We've done a ton of other videos on that, right? And so it's part of the point in this part of the paper is like, look, even if faith as an attitude that's more belief-like is epistemically rational, these acts of faith could still be practically rational. And I think it's important to recognize that, like, even if all my later arguments about epistemic rationality fail, there could still be this really important sense in which faith is rational.
Yeah, that was both of those thought experiments are really helpful. Good, okay, now, I thought this was really good in the paper. You actually try to put into an argument form the new atheist objection to faith. So what is that argument?
Yeah, so now we're kind of honing in specifically on this epistemic or this truth-aimed rationality. And we're thinking about the question, is faith epistemically rational or not? And I guess I'll say too, while my main audience, or my main, I guess, interlocutor maybe was the new atheists, I think that this probably goes beyond just the new atheists, but I did kind of get this argument from doing this Control F thing and looking at all the things they say about faith. So I tried to kind of put their argument that faith is epistemically irrational into a really basic syllogism. And so it really just has two premises and a conclusion. So premise one is that everyone, or at least almost everyone who has faith, is epistemically irrational. And then premise two is that all theistic or religious believers have faith. So conclusion, all or at least most theistic believers are irrational. So claim one is a claim about faith being irrational, and then claim two is a claim about theistic or religious believers having faith, and then from that we get this claim that theists or religious people are irrational.
Yeah, that's a nice simple syllogism, but are the premises true? It's valid. Yes. The argument's valid, but are those premises true? It seems like the strength of the argument depends on one's account of faith. So exactly. A big chunk of your paper is going through various accounts of faith that the new atheists have offered, and you argue that these accounts result in either premise one being false or premise two being false. Can you walk us through those accounts of faith and why you say that?
Yeah, so, and I'll say too, I do encourage, like, if you're really interested in this, or you feel like, oh, like she missed like, a viewer definition of faith that I wanted to talk about, go look at the paper. So what I've done here is I've really divided it into 5 views of faith, but then in the paper I kind of consider like three versions of one of the views, or like some views, that are like related to one of these views or something. So I consider more, I think it's like maybe 8 to 10 in the paper, but then for the sake of time, I've kind of divided it into really 5 here. So I'm trying to kind of simplify and summarize, but there's more in the paper if you want more. So, okay, the first sort of definition of faith that I consider is just almost, and you see people do this, like I think new atheists do this, but I think people on the internet do this too, where you just define faith as epistemically unjustified attitude. So like by definition, that's what faith is. It's not like faith is this other thing and then that is epistemically unjustified. We're just defining it that way. Okay, so that's sort of our first definition of faith. There's a few reasons why I think this may not be the way they want to go, and I also don't think this is like the strongest way to get faith to be irrational, or to at least get our argument to go through. And so the first is that I think that they want to argue that theism or religious beliefs are irrational. They don't just want to stipulate it. And part of that is just, you see that in their writings. They're trying to give, the problem of evil, or, various arguments like, look how bad religion is for society, or, whatever. So I don't think they just want to stipulate that faith is irrational. I think they want to give arguments for it. And so I think part of the problem here is like, of course, if you just define, faith as epistemically irrational, then P1 is going to come out true. People who have faith are going to be irrational. But then all the work is going to have to go on P2, which is convincing me that religious believers have faith. And often when people define faith as this irrational thing, I just try to use a different word. So I'll just say, okay, well, what about trust? Or, what about a commitment or something, and then I think, it's kind of less obvious. Well, people who trust people, are they all irrational by definition? I think that's a lot less clear. So yeah, I think on this definition, sort of faith is epistemically irrational, that comes out to be true. But then you have to do a lot of work to convince me that all religious believers just have this epistemically unjustified attitude. And in the paper, I go into a little bit more the number of different arguments that have been given for the rationality of religious belief, going really back to a bunch of historically significant philosophical thinkers like Anselm and Aquinas and Augustine. But then even recently, kind of with Alvin Plantinga, and then there's this whole Reformed epistemology tradition that you've done a ton of other interviews on. Andrew Moon is one person you've done interviews on with that, but a number of different philosophers I know you've had on to talk about that, trying to argue that, even the average churchgoer who doesn't necessarily engage with like the ontological and cosmological arguments, they could still be justified in their religious beliefs. And so I think on this conception, there's going to be a lot of work the new atheist is going to have to do, kind of interacting with all of these pretty sophisticated epistemological arguments that theist or religious people are irrational. And so, if you're going to define faith this way, I would just say, okay, sure, theists and religious people don't have faith then. Mm-hmm. So that's sort of the summary of that. I don't know if there's anything you want to add, or
Nope.
Or maybe I missed. Okay, cool. So that's kind of the first definition. I guess there is 5, so we don't want to spend too long on each one. And I go into the paper a little bit more detail, some reasons to think that all theists just aren't just by definition irrational. So you can check that out. Okay, so number 2, this is actually based on something that Sam Harris directly says, but I think is really philosophically interesting. Probably not for the reasons he thinks is interesting, but he basically suggests that faith self-justifies, or it justifies itself. It's epistemically self-justifying. It's entirely self-justifying is what he says. So maybe he thinks this is bad because it's like circular or something, but I actually think this is like really philosophically interesting, because there actually has been some work on like these self-justifying attitudes, and the basic idea, or the kind of what's going on in these cases, is that sometimes when you believe something, probably in like maybe sort of rare cases, but that belief actually creates evidence for itself. So if you are about to undergo like a very serious surgery, and maybe your chance of survival is like 50-50, there's some really interesting evidence that if you actually believe you'll survive, at least in some cases, it actually makes it more likely that you'll survive the surgery. And so in virtue of forming the belief, that actually gives you evidence that the belief is true. There's another case I talk about in the paper where that William James has, where you're lost in the wilderness and you have to jump across this really wide ditch or crevice to kind of make it back to civilization. And if you believe you won't make the jump, you're less likely to try, you're going to have a lot less motivation, and you're going to be less likely to make the jump. Whereas if you believe you will make the jump, then you'll have a lot more motivation and energy and passion to kind of really make that jump across. And so there's been a number of cases like in the literature and epistemology that I think are really interesting that kind of have this structure. But I think it's also could be true of like if you communicate to someone else that you have faith in them. So if I'm like, Jordan, I have faith that you're going to win your basketball game tonight, that might also give you, more like energy to play hard. And you're like, someone's cheering for me, like that kind of thing. That could actually make it more likely that you would win your game. And so this like epistemically justifying itself thing, I don't think this is what Harris intended, but I think these are really interesting cases actually. So they're going to be cases where I think premise one, which is that everyone who has faith is irrational, is actually just false, because self-justifying attitudes are justified.
Yeah, if it's self-justifying, then it's justified, and then premise one would be false.
Exactly. I also think though it's actually not totally clear to me that this exact model applies to faith in God. It's not clear that having faith in God would make it more likely that God existed. There's other ways you could tweak this to, I think, maybe make it work. So maybe having faith in God would reveal evidence that you didn't previously have access to or something like that. But it's not clear that either P1 or P2 would be true on this definition. So I included it because I'm interested in the self-justification thing, but I don't think it's a good way to get faith being epistemically irrational.
Okay, that was the second account of faith. What about the third one?
Yep. Okay, so we have three more. So the third one has to do with what's known as inquiry, where inquiry is a word that epistemologists use just to mean gathering evidence. And then when you think about, like gathering evidence, you might think of like a detective going to a crime scene, or you might think about like going to the library to read a book. But it's actually even broader than that. Like when I like check my phone to see like what time the interview is tonight, I'm engaging in inquiry. I'm like gathering evidence about the time of the interview. If I like go downstairs to try to find my car keys, I'm like inquiring. I'm engaging in inquiry. I'm gathering evidence about like where my car keys are. So we actually engage in inquiry all the time. It's like a very common thing. And the idea here, and I give some quotes to support some of the new atheists say things that like faith is opposed to inquiry or something like that. But the idea here is that if someone has faith, they don't either inquire at all, or maybe they don't sufficiently inquire into their faith commitments. So I actually treat those separately in the paper, but I just put them together for the sake of this interview. Okay, so this is an interesting thought. Maybe people with faith, the problem is they're not gathering enough evidence. That's maybe the way of summing it up. So I think this raises a couple of different questions. The first is just the general question, well, what kind of duties to inquire into our beliefs do we have? And when does failing to inquire make a belief irrational? I think that's a really big question. It's kind of in the background here. And I will note this. I don't think it's true that we have to always inquire into every belief we have in order for that belief to be rational. Some beliefs we have, I think they're just kind of like self-evidently true, like 1 + 1 = 2, or torturing babies for fun is wrong. I don't think I have to go like read a bunch of moral philosophy or like find some mathematical proof in order to be justified to believe those things. So that's one example of beliefs I think we don't have to inquire into in order to be rational to have them. Another is just like sort of basic perceptual or testimonial beliefs. So you just see a cup on the table, you can believe there's a cup without like having to examine it and lift it up and, you do all this stuff to it and really make sure, like check with someone else. Do you see that cup too? You don't have to, you can just believe it, or Jordan, if you tell me like, after this, I'm going to go cook some noodles, I can just believe you. Like I don't have to like call up your wife and be like, is Jordan cooking noodles? Do you see a package of noodles in the trash can? Like, I can just believe you, So I think a lot of like our everyday perceptual and testimonial beliefs, we can just we see the evidence and we form the belief. We don't have to go do a bunch of inquiry in order for them to be rational. And if we did, we would have a lot less rational beliefs. In fact, it would be some kind of skepticism, I think. Not full-blown skepticism, but it would be hard to justify a lot of our beliefs. So that's the one thing to note. So what you would need to do here is you would need to tell me a story or explain to me, okay, so maybe we don't have to inquire into all of our beliefs if we don't want to go into skepticism. So but we do have to inquire into this subset of beliefs, and religious beliefs fall in that subset, and religious people don't do the kind of inquiry that's needed. So there's kind of a lot of steps there that we have to get. And I will say, like, I'm open to the idea that for some beliefs we do need to inquire somewhat. Maybe beliefs that are really, really important, or maybe beliefs that there's a lot of disagreement about, or, something like that. But what we're going to have to do is we're going to have to set the bar at a place where both P1 and P2 end up coming out true. So in order to have this idea that everyone who has faith is irrational, we're going to have to set the bar high enough so that people that have faith don't meet the bar of inquiry. They're not inquiring enough into their faith. But in order to get this idea that all theistic believers have faith, we have to set it also low enough that whatever inquiry all theistic believers are doing, it's not going to meet that bar. And so I think the problem is, as we raise the bar, so let me get this right. As we raise the bar, P1 starts to look false, and as we lower the bar, P2 starts to look false. And part of that is because religious believers are doing some kind of inquiry into their faith. For different people, it looks differently, obviously. I mean, there's people that like watch your channel every week and are very into like the arguments and, that kind of thing. And they're doing like very serious, like philosophical inquiry, or maybe like historical or scientific. They're looking at that kind of evidence. And of course, that's not everyone, but even the average person in the pew, they're sensitive and looking for certain kinds of evidence for their religious beliefs. So whether that's experiential evidence, there's been extensive discussions and defenses of the idea that experiences of God, more controversially, could justify religious belief, but less controversially, at least count as evidence for religious belief. And you did a whole interview actually with Kevin McCain about this idea that there's no evidence for God's existence, or there's no evidence for theism. And people should check that out if you're like, that doesn't count as evidence. Like, no, by most conceptions of evidence, it counts as evidence.
Right.
So, but then there's also, testimonial evidence, whether that's the testimony of the disciples, the testimony of, religious people in their community, the testimony of their pastor or priest. And so I just think, look, like, they are doing some kind of inquiry. And so what you have to do is you have to tell me why that inquiry isn't enough, but then why all these other non-religious beliefs are still justified. And so I think it's just, it's going to be really hard. I'm pessimistic that we have this place to set the bar where we can say they're not doing enough inquiry, but all these other religious beliefs are justified. And faith is irrational because of this lack of inquiry. So that's kind of what I say there. I say a little bit more about it in the paper, but does that make sense? Is that sufficient?
No, that's good. Okay,
Cool.
So we've gone through 3 accounts. There's 2 more to go.
Yep.
What about the 4th one?
Yeah. Okay. So now we're kind of 4 and 5 kind of hone in on evidence. And this is actually, I think, a common thing you hear a lot, is that faith is in some way opposed to evidence, or the problem with faith has to do with something about evidence. And so 4 is kind of more general, and then with 5, we'll get more specific, talking about different kinds of evidence. So 4 is just this idea that faith isn't based on adequate evidence. That's kind of what faith is. Faith is this attitude that's not based on adequate evidence. And that's different than the first one we talked about. The first one we talked about just said faith is by definition unjustified. This is slightly different because you need a step to get to it being unjustified. And that step is what's often known as evidentialism, which is the view that a belief needs to be based on evidence in order to be rational, or evidence is the thing that kind of makes our beliefs rational or irrational. And so I think evidentialism, it's controversial. So, not everyone accepts it. And in fact, like Andrew Moon and Flanagan, a bunch of people have this alternative view about what makes beliefs irrational. That's more what's known as externalist. But for the sake of argument, it's reasonable enough, right? So we can grant that evidentialism is true. And so then if evidentialism is true, then P1 would be true. If faith is not based on adequate evidence, then faith would be irrational.
Yeah.
So that's fine. Here's the problem, though. Of course, you know where I'm going, right? So then we have to say, okay, is P2 true? Is the faith of religious believers not based on evidence? And this kind of comes back to some of the things we were saying earlier. But the problem is that most religious believers do base their beliefs on some kind of evidence. That may not always be a very intense philosophical argument because they just read Planigo last week, right? But that evidence might be a more common everyday source of evidence like testimony or experience or perception or something. And so the problem is, so you might want to say, well, no, they need to base it on like the philosophical evidence or the scientific evidence. But then the question is why? And if you say, well, it's because testimony and experience aren't valid sources of evidence, you're going to be ruling out all these everyday common sense beliefs, like, my belief you're going to have pasta for dinner, or my belief that there's a cup on the table, or whatever. And I think moreover, a lot of the people that are trying to make these arguments like faith is irrational and here's all these reasons why, they say we can rely on testimony and experience in some cases. They rely on the testimony of scientists all the time. I mean, they trust what scientists say without doing the experiments themselves, right? They also would probably be fine with someone being like, I experienced a lot of evil in my life, so now I don't believe in God anymore, So it seems like they're fine with testimony and experience in at least some cases. And so it's not at all clear, like, why we could just say testimony and experience don't count for in the religious case, but count in these other cases, And so I think the problem here is then, yeah, sure, P1 is true if evidentialism is true, but then this idea that religious believers don't base their faith on evidence, that it's not clear that they do. And in fact, they do base their faith on evidence. It's just not maybe this certain kind of evidence that you really like. And so I actually think that leads really nicely into the final definition, which has to do with what's known as empirical evidence. So empirical evidence, it's kind of like scientific evidence, but a little bit broader. So empirical evidence is sort of like evidence we get by studying the world around us. And so I kind of, again, here consider three different definitions of faith, but I'm sort of wrapping them into one. And so you might think, well, the problem with faith, sure, maybe it's based on like testimony and experience, but it really should be based on empirical evidence we get by like physically studying the world around us, so not testimony and experience. And I say another possibility is that the problem is that faith isn't testable or falsifiable. Like when we have a scientific theory, we can go then test that and then, either falsify it or maybe get evidence in favor of it if the test we do ends up being consistent with the theory. But maybe when I say God exists, that's like not testable in the same way. And so that's the problem. There's actually a ton of quotes that suggest this is a problem with faith that the new atheists have. So I can kind of treat these two together. So there's like the worry it's not based on empirical evidence and the worry it's not testable or falsifiable. Okay. So a couple points to make here. I guess, so yeah, now we're looking at P1 and P2. So would this mean faith is epistemically irrational? And then if so, would we have a reason to think that theistic believers have faith? So I think the first point to make is that we have a lot of beliefs that aren't based solely on empirical evidence that are perfectly rational. And so this is kind of a common, I think a lot of people, like a lot of theists kind of like recognize this, and even some of the new atheists and some of the like more recent books recognize like you can't say like only empirical evidence is the only valid source of evidence. We sort of covered this before too. You can trust people's testimony, you can trust certain experiences, that kind of thing. And so you might think, well, you need at least some empirical evidence for a belief to be rational. Like even if it doesn't have to be only empirical evidence, you need at least there to be part of the basis or part of the evidence for the belief. But it's not clear that that's right either. And so the problem here is that there's this whole host of beliefs that theism might be one of the members of this group, but there's all these other beliefs that I think, both people in general, but definitely the new atheists specifically, they're not going to want to rule out. They're not going to want to say are irrational, but it's not clear that these beliefs are based on empirical evidence at all. Okay, so some examples. My beliefs about the past, my beliefs about memory. I can't go test them or falsify them, at least a lot of them, like that I woke up at, 9:15 this morning or whatever time I woke up, you can't just go do a scientific study to determine that. But it seems like my memory beliefs, my beliefs about the past can be rational. My beliefs about math, logic, morality, sort of these big topics in philosophy, not clear they're based on empirical evidence, not clear that they're testable or falsifiable, especially, when we get into like the very intense math where I can't just be like, one pen plus one pen is two pens, you know. There's even a debate about whether that is based on empirical evidence or whether that's something that's coming from some other faculty that's not, you know, just based on like objects in the world. But you know, you start to get into this very intense math and you can't just like model that with physical objects, right? But you know, moral beliefs, my beliefs about logic, those I think too, you know, you're going to have a lot of trouble giving me a story about how all of those are based on empirical evidence. There's also my belief about induction. So induction is this principle that's really, really fundamental to scientific practice, which is basically the idea that, you know, the way that the past is, the future is going to be similar. So if water quenches my thirst in the past, then water will quench my thirst in the future. And this is really kind of a thing that scientists often just assume, and it's really hard to kind of give an argument, especially if someone's skeptical of induction. This is a thing that Hume sort of famously noted. And you can't really give empirical evidence for this. That's almost like something that comes before you sort of assume that and then start looking at the empirical evidence. So, you know, even the belief, a lot of the things we've been talking about today, like beliefs about epistemic rationality or the belief that empirical evidence is required for a belief to be justified, those kinds of beliefs aren't ones that are going to be based on empirical evidence or aren't ones that are going to be testable or falsifiable by the scientific method. And so those are just some examples. I could probably go on for a while, but there's this whole class of beliefs that don't seem to be based on scientific or empirical evidence, or they're not testable, at least by a scientific method, but we want to say those beliefs can be rational for people. So that's basically the main problem, is like, why are those beliefs in and theistic beliefs out? What's the difference there? That's not at all clear. And it's not clear that appealing to empirical evidence can help us draw the line there.
Yeah.
So that's sort of the main point I wanted to make. But a secondary point that I think is also important, there is some empirical evidence for religious beliefs. So the fine-tuning argument, that's a classic case. I think a lot of at least atheist philosophers think that's kind of like a more compelling, at least bit of evidence for theism. And that's empirical evidence for God's existence, right? There are also religious claims that are falsifiable. So if we found Jesus's body, right, that would be a very good reason to reject Christianity if we knew it was Jesus's body. So I think, you know, all of what I said at first sort of was saying there, let's grant there's not empirical evidence for religious claims. But now I'm saying, but it's not even clear that there's not any empirical evidence for religious claims. So I think if we say faith is this thing that's not based on empirical evidence, it's just not clear that P1 is going to be true and that people with faith are going to be epistemically irrational. And that second thing is also, and it might not even be clear that religious believers have faith, because there is empirical evidence for faith claims. So those are the five. I can like say them all very quickly, or I don't know, but like basically
I'll give a stab at summing this up.
Okay, yeah,
and then
you should sum it up.
We'll look at the second half of the paper. Cool. So the new atheists give an argument. Premise 1 is everyone or almost everyone who has faith in it is epistemically irrational. Premise 2 was all theistic believers have faith, and the conclusion then is all theistic believers are epistemically irrational. Okay, now you say, well, wait a minute. That the success of that argument depends on your account of faith, and you think that the accounts that the new atheists have given results in either premise 1 being false or premise 2 being false based on the account they give. So I'll run quickly through the 5. One account was that faith is just defined as unjustified. Faith just is an unjustified belief, or it's epistemically unjustified. The second account was faith epistemically justifies itself. The third account was if someone has faith, they don't sufficiently inquire into their faith commitments. The fourth account was faith is not based on adequate evidence. And the fifth and final one was faith is not based solely on empirical evidence, or faith is not falsifiable or testable. Okay, and I can't repeat all the reasons why each one of those results in either premise 1 being false or premise 2 being false, but that's the claim you defend. So all of that was kind of a long way of saying, here's what faith is not. Now what I want to focus on in the last half is, what is faith? I don't want to know what it isn't. I want to know what it is. So can you tell me, what is faith?
Yeah, good. So maybe I'll sort of stick to the paper, but I'm also happy to like go beyond it and give kind of like my more general view of faith. But part of what I want to do in this paper is not just give a negative account, but kind of say what are some things we can like learn from this positively about the nature of faith. And so in the paper, I really kind of give two main suggestions for like a positive view of faith. And so the first is actually goes back to that self-justifying thing we talked about. And so the first thing I suggest is that interpersonal faith, so maybe the faith we have in each other, and also intrapersonal faith, so the faith I have in myself, that could be self-justifying. And this actually goes back to, I think, some things that William James says, who's a philosopher I'm a big fan of. But William James gave that example of jumping the crevice and how if you believe it, it'll make it more likely to be true. So there's a number of cases where, if I'm about to go do something or perform some action and I believe I'll be successful, that can make it more likely I'll be successful. But then I also think there could be cases, and I think I gave some examples of this as well, where if I sort of have faith in someone else and communicate that to them, that can also make it more likely they'll be successful. I think like sports fans are a very common case of this, but even just when we, encourage each other and try to say like, I think you're going to do great at that. And, try to dispel people's doubts about themselves, like that sort of thing. So I actually think interpersonal and intrapersonal faith could be self-justifying in the way that they create evidence for themselves. And what's cool about this is faith is based on evidence. It's not saying faith is just ignoring the evidence or opposing the evidence. No, there's that evidence there, but it's going beyond the evidence in the sense that you first form the belief or you first form the faith and then the evidence follows, which is like super fascinating to me because normally you see the evidence and then the belief follows. So it's sort of reversing the order of that, which I think is interesting. I say in the paper that like not 100% sure this exact model would apply to God. The closest thing we could get is that maybe theistic faith reveals evidence that the person wasn't previously aware of, but I don't know that it's going to create evidence in the way that it can in the intra and the interpersonal case. Mm-hmm. So that's sort of the first positive thing I say about faith. Then the second thing that I suggest in the paper is that it might also be this last definition that says faith is not solely based on empirical evidence. That might also be true of faith. It might be that faith, in a lot of cases, goes beyond the empirical or the tangible evidence. And again, this doesn't mean faith opposes or isn't based on evidence at all. But what this means is that faith is based on other sources of evidence, not merely just empirical evidence. I think it could be based partially on empirical evidence, and I gave examples with the fine-tuning argument and stuff like that. But I think one thing that's commonly thought is that faith is actually often closely connected to trusting someone else's testimony, whether that be, like a friend or family member, another person, or God. And I think this can capture that nicely. Maybe there's some empirical evidence or some of that to back it up, but a lot of what you're going off of is kind of the other person's word. You're sort of taking their word for it. And I think this can explain why, faith and trust are closely connected. It could also explain too why faith is often seen to be contrasted with like having solid proof of something. Like if I proved something mathematically or scientifically, you might not need faith to accept it. But if, you're kind of going off of someone's testimony, then it seems a lot more natural to think faith would be involved. I actually think, too, there's like some biblical passages that make sense of this. We live by faith, not by sight. Faith is the evidence of things unseen. And so the general thought is like, it's not that empirical evidence isn't relevant or isn't important, but in a lot of cases, it's just not going to get you the whole way there. You kind of need more, in your thinking and in your acting to kind of just like make decisions and interact in the world and, just be a person with relationships and commitments and that kind of thing.
Yeah. I don't think we have time to go into your 4-part definition of faith.
No worries.
But maybe, do you have, where can people find the paper that you expound that 4-part definition?
That one is a paper that's called Faith and Reason, and it's on like my website, and you can download it on Phil Papers. I also have, if you go on my YouTube channel, I recently in the past couple months did like a 2-part series on faith. And so if you do the first one about what faith is, I explain it in a lot more detail there. So you can check that out if you want to see more.
Excellent. Yeah. Okay. So last question for you. If you only had 60 seconds to respond to this question, what would you say? Someone says to you, Liz, can faith be rational?
This is really hard. So there was a few things I wanted to say, but I wasn't fully satisfied, but I will just jump in. So I only have 60 seconds, right? The first thing I want to say is I think the can in the question is very important. So my view is not that faith is always always rational, no matter what. I think it's like belief. Our beliefs can be rational. Our beliefs can be irrational. Same with faith. We can have rational faith and irrational faith. And if I have faith that like my horoscope is the answer to all my problems, that is not rational. It might even be that in some cases religious faith is irrational. I'm not saying it's always rational no matter what. So that's the first thing. Can faith be irrational? Not why is faith always irrational? But beyond that, I think the answer is yes, faith can be rational. And I think the way I would sort of go about explaining why would depend on the audience. So there are people that just hate the word faith. And we kind of talked about this a little bit at the beginning. And I'm not hung up on the word. So I'm happy to just like use another word like trust and kind of make sure we're getting at the same concepts. Because if you say, can ignoring evidence be rational? It's like in most cases, probably not, So that's one thing to say. I think another thing to point out and to note is that faith isn't just a religious thing. Faith is not this only thing that religious or theistic believers have, but no, we have faith in ourselves. We have faith in our close family members and friends. We even have faith in kind of like ideals or something like I have faith in recycling, or I have faith in capitalism, or I have faith in some kind of like moral view or political party or something like that, right? And so it's not just this solely religious thing. And I think part of this is because part of the function of faith, in my view, is that it helps us keep our commitments over time. And this can be a good thing because we did another interview about this, and maybe I'll point people to that. But the basic idea is that we can get counter evidence and we can get, our desires can fade. But these things aren't always pointing us towards the true or the good. Sometimes we get counter evidence that's misleading. And so faith can kind of help us continue in that commitment, even in light of, like, for example, misleading evidence. So I don't think faith requires that we ignore evidence or oppose evidence. And I don't think that there's one specific feature had by like all theistic or religious people that's irrational. But I think faith plays a really important role, really important function in the lives of both the religious and the non-religious. So that's my answer. Might have been a little longer than 60 seconds.
Hey, that's okay. All right. Well, thank you so much, Liz, for doing this. I loved this paper. I will definitely point people to this paper if they're wondering, can faith be rational? I think it surveys a lot of good ideas, and you do a good job with it.
Thanks so much. Yeah, it was a lot of fun to write. I had a fun time kind of going through all the definitions and stuff. So I hope others enjoy it too.
Yeah. And I'll mention for the viewer, an interview you definitely should go check out that I did with Liz was this one on getting counter evidence and looking at faith in more detail in relationship to counter evidence. So check that out. Also, I'm going to be interviewing Chris Tweet on his account of faith, which when I read the paper, I was like, wow, this makes a lot of sense. I can see there's something to this. So I'm looking forward to doing that interview with him. So make sure you watch that. And my patrons get access to the document that Liz and I just used for this discussion. So I think these are super helpful because say you listen to the video and you catch a lot of things, but there were some things that you're like, I want to go look at that. I didn't quite catch that point. Having this document's really helpful to go back and look at each point that Liz made in response to all those different accounts of faith. So again, my patrons have access to that document, and you can become a patron by going to the link in the description of this video and sign up for any amount you'd like. All right, so thank you all for watching, and keep exploring Christianity.